Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, everyone, ladies and gentlemen from all over the world. Welcome to the last session of today and also the final session of Digital Discourse Online Conference organized by Goethe-Institut Indonesia, Center for Digital Society and Engaged Media. My name is Aji. I'm a master's student in engineering and policy analysis at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. And currently I'm pursuing my specialization in energy policy and market at the Technical University of Munich, Germany. I will be your moderator for the next hour. I hope that all of you are excited to participate in the session, Futures Imaginaries, is science fiction a prediction or image inspiration? Here, we will discuss the role of science fiction in imagining the future. To what extent science fiction is able to predict and niche the trajectories of future, and also how can fiction raise ethical issues around the future of technology and society. And also, the most awaited session of all, we will hear a reading of short fiction stories by our today's speaker. Joining us today is our honorable speaker, Stephen Oram. Stephen Oram writes near-future novels and short stories. He also works with scientists and technologists to explore future possibilities through short stories, and is also a writer for sci-fi prototypers, Sci-Futures. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please give the warmest welcome for Stephen Oram.
Thank you so much, Aji. And yeah, this is exciting, and thank you for inviting me. It's very nice to be here, and very nice to be at the end as well. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to speak for around about half an hour, and then we'll have a decent amount of time for questions and hopefully some answers as well from me based on what I'm going to say. So I've got a set of slides that I'd like to share. Don't worry, I'm not just going to read a set of slides out. You can read them while I'm kind of talking around the edges of them. So hopefully, if I've worked out my technology right, I'll be able to share those in a minute, and then I get into my I think so. Let me. Okay, now you're going to see them all now, because what I've realized is I was at the end of them when I shared them. So there you go. There's a backwards glimpse. Is that showing, Edgy? Are they coming up?
Yes, we can see it clearly.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so as you said, this is around influencing and predicting the future using speculative fiction, and three kind of questions there that will sort of frame what I'm going to talk about. The role of sci-fi in imagining the future. Does its predictions affect the future, and how can we use it to raise ethical issues around the future of technology and society? You've done a very good introduction to me, so I'll skip over this slide because it basically says what you said already. Just focusing on the middle bit there a little bit. So this is my kind of strap line, if you like, about nudging the future and reminding people that it is ours and it's up for grabs. And by ours, I mean all of us. So we can all have a say in it. So I guess when we're thinking about fiction, speculative fiction, the first part of that is, are stories important at all, apart from just to entertain? I've got a couple of quotes here from Danby, who's a neuroscientist I've done a lot of work with, and also Douglas Rushkoff, who, if you're not familiar with him, I think it's MIT pitch him as the sixth most influential thinker in the world of technology and stuff. So both know what they're talking about, I would say. And they both say the stories are important. Danby, particularly in that way of being able to pass on complex information, different perspectives, etc. And Douglas is that kind of using it to reveal truths we've hidden from ourselves. So I'm starting this on the basis that they are important. And then just to be clear on this, sort of focusing in on speculative fiction, and in particular, in my case, near future fiction. So set in the near future, not any aliens particularly, or spaceships or anything like that, very much sort of grounded in, as I say, the very near future, or the near future. Maybe more along the lines of J.G. Ballard, I think, who famously said his writing, I can't remember which one it was, but is in the next 5 minutes. Now, you know, that's obviously an extreme way of putting it, but that's just to sort of situate where I'm coming from. Then posing the question, you know, can sci-fi predict the future? Well, maybe if enough monkeys and enough typewriters, enough AIs have enough processing power, enough sci-fi authors wrote enough stories, one of them would predict the future. Probably not. But what we can draw on is some work that an organization called Nesta, which is a UK organization, did. I think it was around, it's probably here, 2013, so a while ago now. They did some work looking at how, by trawling the web and some very sophisticated things, how they felt that speculative fiction and science and technology were kind of interacting with each other. And they've come up with these different ways that that might happen. So, as they say here, relatively rare examples where there's a direct translation from a sci-fi technology into a real one. More often, it's that science fiction has influenced the way that the sort of emerging science and technology is framed, how that's kind of talked about. There's some, as they say, obviously inspired particular innovation or industries. They kind of talk about William Gibson and cyberspace and the internet and all that thing. Although I think, might be wrong, I think Gibson actually said, I might have predicted the internet, but it's nothing like the prediction I made. So, you know, how much that's actually inspired it, I think, is up for debate. Certain groups being disproportionately influenced there, that's probably fairly obvious that it's only going to influence people that read science fiction. And then influencing how science and technology are actually understood outside of those specialist areas, and also how they're debated and judged in public. And the two that I'm going to focus on is that last one, and the second one about fictional technologies influencing the way things are framed. That's kind of the work that I've been doing. I think it's also important to, when we're thinking about this, is to think about stories themselves. So stories have a life cycle, I would suggest. So when you're creating a story, there's an element of world building. What's the technology, the politics, the economy, the society, etc. Also, what is the story? What's the narrative, the character, the plot? You know, all stories have that. And then the story is either heard or read or watched. You know, it's received by somebody. Once it's received by somebody, they become the kind of owner of that story to an extent, and they will interpret it, whether that's just inside their own head or when they're actually retelling it and reimagining it. So there's a kind of loop that goes on there, the receiving, interpreting, and being passed on. And I would suggest that there are different ways that science fiction, speculative fiction can interact with the sort of future of science and technology at all those different stages of the story. Another thing I think we do have to consider is, you know, what's the kind of future that we're painting? There's a kind of, some are very, very dystopian futures, others very sort of tech utopian, and those two pictures there are meant to kind of represent those two extremes. I think importantly, though, we have to always be thinking about who has access to influence all those different bits of the story cycle. You know, it isn't, not everyone does, and we should do our best to make sure that they do. You know, it is a privilege to be able to think about the future, whether that's having access to those that are doing it, or whether it's just simply having the time and the headspace to do that. And you know, if you're running 3 jobs, you've got a big family, etc., etc., you probably don't have the time and therefore, are we in danger of getting a skewed audience and influencers around this? I think it's something we would need to think about really carefully. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of projects, most recent ones. I've done quite a few, the most recent ones. The first example is from a project I've just finished with Cyber Salon, which is a think tank, digital think tank in the UK, although it has members all over the world, particularly thinking about agency in a data-driven society, and generally is made up of people who are developing and innovating technologies of the future, so the kind of makers of the future. So an interesting group of people to work with in terms of using sci-fi to have this conversation. This is the final output, and I'll briefly go through how we got to this, but the final output is a book which is a mix of short pieces of fiction, some reflections from some world-leading experts in the different themes that we chose, which were health, community, retail, and money, futures of, and a bit of topping and tailing with introductions and things like that. So I think the final bit here at the bottom is probably my favorite bit of this blurb off the back. So be prepared for warnings and inspirations, so both of those things, from those who speculate about the future, the writers, and those who make it a reality, the developers. So that's the kind of bringing together in this. Just reminding you, coming back to the Nestor thing, of the different ways that sci-fi and science and technology might influence each other. This is those two that I picked out. So here's briefly what we did, and I'll just go through some of these and sort of expand on them a bit, hopefully enough so that we can get into the Q&A and you can ask a lot more rather than me going on and on and on about each particular bit. But in essence, we chose our themes. We asked some experts to provide some input. We put a call out for some stories. The experts and the authors met. We had a public event, and then we produced a book. So that's the kind of framing of it. So I'll go over that a little bit slower now. So themes and subject experts. There's a couple of quotes here from the book that kind of starts to set the scene a bit, the kind of why. But I quite liked Ava's piece around in the old days. I don't know when quite that is, but kind of standing on mountaintops, looking out for warnings and looking out for what was coming. So it sort of goes without saying, when we picked our themes, we needed to make sure that these were things that Cyber Salon could kind of horizon scan, and that they had as part of Cyber Salon there were experts that could do that. So just if you keep that sort of thing in mind about the looking out to the horizon for warnings. And then I quite like this Douglas quote, particularly the bit about creating a sliver of an opening to suppose something new or different. So that's kind of him coming in and saying this is why he felt this was an interesting thing. And again, you know, you can only create that sliver if you've got the right themes and experts to do that. What we then asked of those experts before we asked for stories was we asked them to create a few online resources that the writers of the stories could use as inspiration, both inspiration and as a sort of constraint. Because if you say to people, can you write something about the future of health, that can be incredibly broad. If you say, here's some input, how to sort of narrow in on a particular aspect, that becomes a lot more fruitful, and also gets us to a point where we've got stories that can be used properly in the debate and the event with the experts. And that's basically what we did. We put an open call out, we got a load of stories in, we chose, they had to be kind of well written, but also they had to create a rounded set that would prompt the experts, the audience Q&A, and would help that move that subject on. I'm putting up quotes here. I'm not expecting everyone to have read all of them, but you might be to sort of scooting across. Christine here it's at the back of the book, she interviewed all the authors to see why they were doing it and to think about what it meant from an author's point of view. As I say, we picked a set of stories. David here is a thought leader in digital identity and digital money, so he was on the Future of Money one. Talks about what they had in common and makes the point that we tend to overestimate short-term impact and underestimate long-term impact, and that's one of the things we were trying to kind of disrupt, if you like, with these speculative fiction stories. Then we had a pre-event where the authors almost finalized their stories, and the experts all came together in a kind of private an hour and a half, and we talked about things before finalizing the story. They were very, very rich, and in some ways it's like, oh, we should have recorded those, they were great. But that helped the authors both finalize the stories, warm the experts up, and if the writers wanted, they could then engage with one of the experts just to finalize a few bits of technical detail or to sort of check with them. And we had our event, it was great, and we created a book out of it as well. And there's a couple of quotes about sort of what the book does. I'm now going to move on to the second example, which is one with King's College London, which is, well, it was a one-year project, it's now a three-year project, but we've only completed the first year. So this is about the first year of this project. And it's a project which is looking, so the project generally is a mix of AI experts or AI expert researchers and clinical psychologist researchers, so mental health and AI researchers, looking at whether or not you can automate an approach which has been proved to be successful with humans, which is codifying 5-minute speech samples of mothers talking about their children in order to predict the likely mental health outcomes of those children. Very, very expensive to do with human coders. So if you can do it with AI, you could say great, but obviously that there is loads and loads of layers of ethical issues in that, which we can talk about later. And my job was to basically write 2 pieces of fiction that helped those ethical discussions happen in public communications, public events. The 2 stories were A Mother's Nightmare and Standard Deviations. This is very briefly again, this is how we went about it. So I joined their team meetings, which their team was a mixture of the AI and the mental health specialist. I also interviewed each team member individually. We ran some workshops with the public, both young people and professional clinicians. This was all me getting a sense of what I wanted these stories to be about. I then discussed the potential themes with the project members, and we agreed on those. I wrote 2 stories and then tested them both with the project team and a group of young people. And then we had a public event where the stories were read, and we were designing that to both provoke and inspire debate around this technology. And we used 3 questions that we asked multiple times throughout that event to gauge where people were at. And I'm going to ask this audience, albeit you've not heard a lot about this project, so I'm going to ask you twice, once now and once after I've read the story, what your, I guess, almost instinctive answers to these 3 questions are. So these are the 3 questions, and they should come up in a poll, I think, if that's working properly. There's the poll. So question 1. Is it sensible to predict potential mental health issues? So quite a broad question. Yes, no, don't know is an absolutely fine answer to that as well. Second one, should we use automated tools to minimize the cost and help clinicians? Again, yes, no, don't know. And then the last question, is personal privacy a price worth paying for this technology? So I don't are the answers starting to come in, Archie?
As far as now, what is displayed in my side, it's only the poll.
Okay, well, we'll give it a few seconds more, and then obviously whoever's answered it has answered it, and whoever hasn't. Okay, shall we sort of wrap it up there and see? Can we see the results of the poll? Is that?
I haven't seen the result. Probably the host can help us in terms of displaying the result. Okay, now it's.
Okay, is it sensible? So 60% yes, 20 no. Should we use automated tools? Wow, mainly yes. Is personal privacy a price worth paying? So a few more no's than we had in the first one, but still, so basically a very positive kind of audience around using this stuff, which is interesting. It's very different to the audience that we had when we ran the event, who were definitely on the no end of end of things. So what I'm going to do now, just to finish off, is I'm going to read one of those two stories, which is A Mother's Nightmare. There we are. Which, little bit of promotion, will be in my next short story collection coming out in next summer, called Extracting Humanity. But putting that to one side, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll read A Mother's Nightmare, and then we can move into the Q&A. Although just before they do that, I would like to take another poll to see whether there's been any shift in answers to those questions as a result of hearing the story. So I'll just stop sharing. Okay, so I'll read A Mother's Nightmare. It's around about 5 minutes long, just to give you a sense of how long you have to concentrate. Obviously, it's different when hearing a story to reading it, because you can't flip back. So I encourage you to try not to get too distracted whilst I read this. So anyhow, A Mother's Nightmare. The room had a smell of people. I'm not kidding you. That and polished wood. It was nice, comforting. Not like those NHS rooms, all sterilized and automated, with no human being in sight. The doctor was nice too, the psychiatrist. I liked her, a bit stiff in the way she spoke to me, but you could hear the kindness behind it. I got the feeling she cared, properly cared. It put me at ease. It's what I needed. It's not every day my words would have such a knock-on effect on my daughter Rosie, on her future. I have to be honest though, I was worried, and I know how I get when I'm anxious. Flummoxed. Can't help it really. I blame it on my mother, always urging me to do more, to be better. I guess I have to thank her though. Not for that, of course, but for her savings. All that money she'd saved up to go on the holiday of a lifetime. I hope I did right by using it for Rose's mental health prediction. Not that my mother cares. How can she when she's a pile of ashes? Sorry, that was uncalled for. As well as smelling of people and wood, the room was kitted out with all sorts of gadgetry. On the walls and hanging from the ceiling. Cameras mostly. Those heat-sensing ones they use at airports these days. The ones that check if you're lying. I'm told they can see under your skin, that they can detect all sorts of emotions you'd rather keep hidden. What a world we've made for ourselves. When I arrived, the doctor was sitting there in a low, comfy chair, smiling. "Hello," she said. "Ms. Banbury, isn't it?" I smiled back. "Julie." "So, you want to know how much private healthcare would cost for..." She glanced at the screen on her lap. "Rosie." "Yes, I need a prediction of her future mental health as part of the financial assessment." She waggled a finger at one of the cameras mounted on the wall above her. "Are you happy for the artificial intelligence to begin recording as a backup to me?" I wasn't really, but I don't think I had a choice. "No problem," I said. "Tell me about Rosie." I took a big breath, knowing the next 5 minutes would be crucial. I was desperate to remember word for word what I'd practiced with my friends, but I couldn't get a grip on how we'd decided I should start. I said something about how she was great at drawing and a gifted drummer. I think I may have also said that she was a bit of a maths genius. Small white lie. Then I dried up. Trying too hard, I guess. The lovely doctor let the silence hang there for a while. Probably only a few seconds, but it seemed like hours, until she prompted me with that soft, warm voice of authority. "Let me help. What was she like this morning?" I sighed. Mornings were always the most difficult. She didn't like getting out of bed, even for something she was looking forward to. 5 years old, and already I can see my dad in her. "Mornings," I said and grinned. "She's a nightmare." She didn't see the grin, too busy looking out of the window at the rain. "I see," she said in an irritated, distracted kind of way. Her screen lit up and she lifted it off her lap. I stopped talking and waited for her to say something. She was busy reading and tutting. Eventually, she looked at me and spoke. "Whatever I may think, it would seem that I am in danger of bringing my own emotions into this situation. The AI will take over proceedings." But she looked away. "She's a nightmare. Favourite of my mother's. Please continue." "What am I paying for if the AI is going to do it? I could have done that on the NHS for a lot less money. I want you to carry on." "You don't," she said. "Believe me." I hesitated, wishing the decision wasn't mine to take alone. Sole carer, or as good as. Should I carry on? I had no choice. I started to talk about Rosie. So far off script by now that I wasn't even thinking about what I was saying. Just telling stories about her. Remembering the good times. Explaining the bad. It seemed like a long time before she spoke, to thank me for being so open and honest. Apparently, it had only been 5 minutes. It seemed a lot longer. She consulted her screen before speaking. "My faithful AI here concludes that there's a 60% chance that Rosie will develop some issues later in life, and that its prediction is accurate to around 73%. I was flabbergasted. I'd expected something more rounded, more verbal, less number crunching. "What do you think? Do you agree with it?" I asked. To be honest, most of the time it's better at this stuff than me. But I'm here with you. We're talking. Rosie isn't a statistic. True, but I'm biased. Although it's also true that I can spot the anomalies better than it can. I can deal with complexity much better too. I don't have to categorize everything. She hesitated, as if she was trying to decide what to say next. Despite my abilities, it has access to a lot more experience than I do, and when you've gone, it'll give me a training session to improve my performance. I pulled a face. I couldn't help it. Why on earth don't you work together? She ignored me and handed me the screen. "There's the cost," she said. "Based on Rose's physical condition and all the other data we hold on her," she quickly added. 2 sets of numbers were displayed. The average healthcare package, which came in at 17% of earnings, 5% above the NHS, and Rose's at 39%. Even by claiming the national insurance back, which I could if I was to go private, this was way out of my reach. The doctor seemed to sense my despair. "There is an alternative," she said. "Go on." She told me all about a trial that Rosie could join. Her data would be gathered and sold to the NHS. They needed to increase the diversity of their training data for their version of the predictive AI. And as long as Rosie was on the trial, she'd get her private healthcare at the average rate of 17%. I have to say, it seemed like a win-win to me, so I agreed right there and then. The doctor began the process of uploading Rosie's data into the trial. She gave me a running commentary about how Rosie really fitted the bill. She was the right sex, gender, and ethnicity. With a big grin, the doctor also confirmed that we were in one of the least represented socioeconomic groups. It was all going well. Until there's one part of the data that we need to complete for full acceptance into the trial, which is we need a 5-minute sample of Rose's father speaking about her. It won't take long to organise, and then you're good to go. And there it was, again. Without a father, Rosie was excluded. It didn't matter why her father wasn't to hand, and I certainly wasn't going to tell them. "She doesn't have one," I said, a little abruptly. The doctor folded her arms and sighed. She seemed to be collecting her thoughts, and then, in a soft voice, she spoke. "I am so sorry for you both," she said. So that's A Mother's Nightmare. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Can we thank you very much for the little applause hands that are going up there, and the heart. Oh, so nice. Oh, 3 hearts. Oh, it's getting better. Can we run the poll again, and then move into any questions or comments or whatever that anyone has. So same questions again. Now obviously we won't know from the poll whether, even if it's the same, as loads of people change their minds, but the same number of people have moved from one to the other and back again. So highly unlikely that would happen, but we might at some point in the next 25 minutes or whatever be asking who changed their mind and if they want to say why. So okay, we'll just give it another few seconds. Okay, shall we assume everyone's had a good chance to answer and close the poll, and actually and see what the results are. Oh, it's gone. Can you see? Oh, there we are. Okay. Now, my memory was it was around about 60% yeses, wasn't it, when we started? So that seems to have so I should have written it down, I realise now, but from memory, that's fewer yeses and more don't knows, I think, on the first one. I think the second one, fewer don't knows, but more knows is my memory, and more don't knows on the third one. So interestingly, this has had the same effect that we had in the public event that we ran. However, from here we've gone from a more positive to a more don't know kind of situation, or more knows. There we went from a no again to more don't knows, but a slightly tilted towards yes. So that's fascinating. Brilliant. Well, that's the kind of end of me talking through my slides and the story. Shall we see if there are any questions, RG? Over to you, really.
Okay. Many thanks, Stephen. It's a really thought-provoking and insightful presentation, and also a sci-fi story reading. We learned a lot about how speculative and near future science fiction shed some lights and also influenced the future of our technology and society. We also got to see how the thoroughly careful, creative, and thought process behind the creation of science fiction writings go as far as like practicing actual scientific polls and also consulting academic experts. Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, we are entering the Q&A session. I believe that all of you are now very excited to ask some questions to Stephen. However, let me remind you again that you can write down your question through the Q&A feature in this Zoom meeting. But before we dive through the submitted question, I have a question myself for you, Stephen. Okay. So my question is that I'm also a huge fan of sci-fi, especially your works, but we already see how like sci-fi to some extent can like predict or niche the trajectories of the future technologies. For instance, like Isaac Asimov with iRobot, he can like niche the trajectory of current AI development, and like George Orwell 1984, we all know about surveillance capitalism that's currently happening. And also Michael Crichton with Jurassic Park, even they already discussed about genetic modification ethics, and now everyone's talking about the ethics of designer babies, which is also a genetic modification. However, I also I want to quote a saying from the CEO of Intel, Andy Groover, ex-CEO of Intel. He said that high tech runs 6 times faster than the government. There is like a lot of people knows that the sci-fi goes beyond to predict the future. However, like the government, policymaker, the stakeholder that is actually responsible for the society because of the innovation, has been failed to kind of predict the trajectories of the future. What is your take on this phenomenon, and what would you suggest for like sci-fi community to bridge the gap between innovation and how real life stakeholders actually address the societal impact of those innovations?
Okay, so very good question. So I think there's a number of sort of aspects probably to that question. So when we talk about science fiction predicting the future, I think the first thing there is to think about what is it predicting. So, you know, if sci-fi writers are engaged, either are scientists themselves or engaged, which a lot of those early sci-fi writers were, or like myself, I'm not, but I'm constantly engaged with scientists and technologists, then there's a kind of conversation that's going on in that space around what's the sort of general direction of technology. And you know, we know there's a lot of new technologies, and not all of them land, and some of them land with a big thump, like communications technologies in the last few years, and others kind of don't. So there's a conversation which is kind of hinting and kind of predicting, but I would say more extrapolating rather than predicting. I think where science fiction really comes into its own is where it then kind of predicts some of the social human elements of those technologies. Now, it won't predict accurately what the world would look like. You know, you mentioned 1984. It's a classic. It's given us a language to talk about surveillance. We all know Big Brother is watching you. We know what that means. We kind of know about doublethink. There's a number. It gives us a language. It kind of gives us a bit of a warning as to what to watch out for. I'd say Brave New World is probably a more accurate prediction in that there's a more willingness of people to be in that dystopia than there is in 1984, and I'd say we're probably willing participants in what we have now. So I think the predicting of possible futures is where science fiction really comes into its own. But there will be things that where technologies first appear in science fiction because they haven't quite yet appeared in the real world. Completely and utterly get your point around governments and trying to write policy and laws around the technology. Now, I would say there's a danger, I think, that you try to write laws, you try to have government policy around individual technologies and individual aspects of those technologies, and that is always going to move too fast for you. You can't do, I would suggest it's impossible to do. So I would suggest that the way to address this as a government is to take that step back and legislate and have policies which are more about protecting the rights and protecting the individuals on a kind of bigger, broader scale that can also include future technologies and not narrow in too much. That would be my suggestion. And I haven't started yet, but I do have a project coming up with the UK, and a branch of the UK government, thinking about 50, 100 years in the future, and helping, I guess, be a bit of a disruptor in the room around what that might look like. So I may change my opinion after I've done that project. I haven't done it yet. But yeah, I think that's that. I don't know if does that kind of give, does that answer your question?
Yeah. It gives me more idea on how like science fiction actually able to inspire people, not only in the terms of innovation, but also in how society address this innovation and react to it. Yeah, it's really interesting, Stephen. However, we already have another question from Anonymous. Say that I do believe that sci-fi is a powerful medium. What I notice, however, as an Indonesian, that the huge amount of sci-fi work lean towards Europe or American communities and based on Europe or many American contexts. Sometimes I wonder, what about the rest of the world? The Cold War, for example, has provoked many future imaginaries, but I barely know something that came out from Asia, for example, or Africa. Is it merely a matter of language barrier, knowledge, or many untranslated works or whatnot, or is there some deeper problem with how us Global South imagine the future?
Wow. So am I qualified to answer this question? So the first thing two things immediately come to mind. One is that I agree with the kind of premise of the question, and the British Sci-Fi Association has been doing quite a lot of work recently with different editions of a magazine called Vector, which has had an issue around Greek sci-fi, Chinese sci-fi, African sci-fi. And I know there's quite a big move on Afrofuturism and all that kind of stuff. This is speaking from a UK perspective. I mean, I don't know. I find it very, very hard to believe that there is not the same amount of imagination, because we're all humans, everywhere in the world. And therefore, it can't be that it doesn't exist, and therefore it must be about, I imagine it's both access to global markets, maybe different. Just there's the person who asked the questions about translation. You know, more people speak English, even if it's as a second language, then well, I say more people, but you know, it's a sort of common language. I don't know. I suspect it's a hang up from couple of centuries ago, you know, from the sort of colonial past of dominant. I don't know. I've read some translations, some Chinese translations, some African translations of work, and it's really interesting to have there is a different sort of starting point. You can get that there's a sort of different starting perspective. Whether it's just the ones I've read, I don't know. The couple of African ones I read in particular were kind of more magic, more fantasy end of things. So that just maybe the ones that I picked. So that's a bit of a ramble from somebody who's not very qualified to answer that question, but I suspect the implication behind the question is accurate.
Okay. Also, I quote actually some saying from your presentation that you also asked about, like, who has the privilege to think about the future. So do you think like it also happens because like probably global south have less access to technology and science in general?
If they do, then probably. I mean, probably less access to the people who are, the Silicon Valley kind of aspect. I hesitate. I'm not. I've been to Indonesia, absolutely delightful place, but I'm not. I don't profess I know, and that was 25 years ago, so I don't profess I know a lot. But yeah, I mean, I think it's something we really need to stop and make sure that everybody in the world, wherever they are, rich and poor, are all getting to be part of that cycle of influence. And sci-fi is one of the ways of doing it. I mean, it's not the only way of doing it, but it's one of the ways of doing that.
Okay. There is another question, Stephen. Also from Anonymous. This is connected to what you say about the fantasy side of sci-fi itself. How do you divide the portion? How to manage the portion between actual scientific prediction or extrapolation, I should say, and pure fantasy, pure imagination while writing a sci-fi book, for instance?
It's a really tricky one, isn't it? So I can't remember whether it was Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke who said any future technology should appear as magic to the current. That's a paraphrase. That's not exactly, but that kind of thing. How do I mean? And there's lots of debate around this, and it's fantasy about magic and things that definitely things that are much more in that realm. I think what I try to do, and it's different. So when I'm working on these projects, I'm much more careful because they are there for a specific purpose, and I always there's an agreement with the scientists and the technologists right at the beginning that they have a veto on the stories. If they feel that one of the stories is taking things too far, and they are not willing to sit on a stage with that story. So the first project I did with Bristol Robotics Lab, we came up with the phrase that, I don't know if you're familiar with Black Mirror, so Black Mirror is okay, Terminator is not. So this kind of, but that's in those projects. Occasionally I do quite like to play around with something that's kind of a bit fantastical and unlikely to ever happen. But I think mainly because what I do is extrapolating what's happening now and then thinking about how would humans be? What would life be like if that technology was around, rather than trying to predict something completely unseen. I guess that's probably how I do it. But I think it's probably a continuum from kind of science fact through science fiction, science fantasy, through to sort of high fantasy.
Okay. There is a really interesting question as well from Sifa. I think it's interconnected with the previous question. So what is usually the biggest challenge in writing sci-fi stories itself?
Wow. So I don't know if this is the biggest, but the first one that comes to mind is particularly with near future stories. So it takes quite a while to get something published. And if you're doing near future stuff, there's a really, really good chance that it will be out of date by the time it gets seen by the public. That's quite a big challenge. I think there are other challenges where, so I tend to kind of, as I would say, sort of skim and scavenge, and I'm not professing to have a big, deep, in-depth knowledge of any particular area of technology. And so I think another challenge is understanding enough to write about it, but actually getting it wrong because you don't understand enough. So I do make sure that I've got technical experts on hand to read through certain bits to go, no, that's not how that wouldn't work like that. Or what are you trying to achieve with that bit of the story? Why not think about it in this way? It does the same, but actually it's more likely that that's how that would work. So I think they're the two sort of challenges.
Okay. In relation to the direction of the story writing itself, you've been an educator, facilitator, and also a writer in sci-fi. What do you see in the writing tendencies of our current generation? Because I also heard, I also followed a little bit about sci-fi, current sci-fi products, and a lot of new trends. I think a lot of writers are trying to explore more about the eco-punk, more positivistic approach to sci-fi instead of traditional dystopian future, this kind of thing. Or do you see any other kind of differences between the styles of a canon sci-fi products and current sci-fi writings, and probably in terms of your own perspective and your own sci-fi writings?
So yes, there is a difference, but I think yes and no. So I think what does sci-fi do? So if sci-fi, famously it's talked about as it being a reflection on what it is we're currently worried about. So it's no surprising that as in different eras, the kind of topics are very different. And I think that also probably leads to slightly different ways of doing it. So if you're particularly thinking about the space age coming and you're writing about space travel and aliens, and the kind if you're thinking about space travel, you're going to bring in aliens. There's a kind of, it happens. If you're thinking about climate change and you're thinking about the world, you're going to bring in more nature and more, you're going to bring in that angle. So I would say, from the stuff I've seen, I'm not saying I'm widely read, but from the stuff I've seen, there's more of that kind of nature stuff coming in. But I think that's kind of inevitable because of what we're currently worried about. And then obviously we've had AI and robots, and the AI, what does it mean to be conscious, all that sort of thing. That's been a fairly standard theme, I think, for quite a long time. But then that's a really fundamental human question, isn't it? So I can see that moving on to I did some work on human brain organoids, so growing human brains in vats and stuff, and that brings a very different flavor to writing about consciousness and sentience than a robot does. It just brings in other ethical things. But anyhow, yeah.
Okay. There is also another question. This is very interesting. Do you think if none of the science fiction literature existed, do you think that we will still have the same technology or innovation as of today?
So I think going back to that Nestor research, their proposal would be No, because of that kind of loop of influence. I think I think if the conversations are happening, whether it's through literature or not, then I think it would be very similar. But I do think it's really important, and I would imagine has influenced what we have today, is having people who are not very, very narrowly focused on fixing the problem in front of them with their science and their technology, and having other people taking a much more broader sort of society view of them, and those two things interacting. So whether it's about the literature or not, I'm not so sure, but I think certainly from the projects I've worked on, the scientists and the technologists have really, really welcomed the opportunity to take that step back and think more broadly, because quite rightly, they're being paid to like fix the next AI problem or the next whatever it is problem, and they're very, very targeted on what they're trying to solve. So you need someone, whether that's government policy, people talking, debating, literature, that kind of pulls it back and knits it all together and goes, hold on, like, so one of the questions I love asking at the beginning of these projects is, if you're successful, how does the world change? And it's a very difficult question for somebody who's very, very targeted on solving the immediate.
Okay. Probably this is going to be the last question because we are short on time. Like lately, especially during the era of pandemics and climate crisis, like we see now, especially through social media, that there are a considerable number of people who are pretty skeptical about science. Do you have to encounter the same issue with science fiction audiences, and like, or instead the science fiction, the fictional sides and recreational nature of science fiction is able to receive different kind of response from those people?
So I think there's an initial resistance to science fiction from people who are not used to science fiction. I think that's a shame, and I think it's probably based on a few science fiction movies that are very popular, and they think it's all about kind of cowboys and Indians in space type of stuff. However, what I've found with my work is that once, and this is the advantage of some of it being very short, is that once people get a taste or a flavor of it, they kind of realize that that's not necessarily the only sort of type of science fiction. And then I think there is much more opportunity, and this is kind of what Douglas Rushkoff is talking about in his introduction to that 22 ideas, is that he reckons that he's come to realize that the people who are listening to what he's saying are the people that agree with him, and it's actually speculative fiction that allows you to kind of move out of that echo chamber and engage with others. So I think it can, but I think it requires quite a bit of effort to break down some preconceptions first.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen, for all the answer, all the new insights. It's really great. I think we have to wrap up our session today. But before that, we would like to hear probably a final closing statement from you. So please, any message to all of our audience today?
Okay, I'll use the one as my tagline, I think. So, which is, as you know, nudge the future, because I think that's how we're actually going to affect it, and to just everybody remember the future is ours and it's up for grabs. It's a kind of a call out to people to say, get involved, help nudge it, help shape it, because we shouldn't just leave it to those who are maybe more typically shaping it on our behalf.
Okay, thank you very much, and huge round of emoji applause, emoji love to Stephen Oram for the fruitful discussion on future imaginaries. Is science fiction a prediction or inspiration? I would like to express our sincere thanks to the audience for the exciting, active participation during the session and all the prayer sessions of this year's Digital Discourse Online Conference. And also thank you to Goethe-Institut Indonesia Center for Digital Society and Engaged Media for organizing this awesome event. So, so I hope from this event we can now see the future with a unique yet illuminating perspective towards innovation and technology. I wish all of you a great rest of the day and see ya at the next Digital Discourse Conference in 2023. Thank you very much, Stephen, once again.
Thank you for having me.
All right, see you, everyone.